When I watch what's happening right now in the United States and the rhetoric that is being used against people who dissent from the actions of the government, it reminds me a lot of the Red Scare. Actually, the United States experienced two major waves of anti communist hysteria in the 20th century, known as the Red Scares. The first Red Scare, which lasted approximately from 1917 to 1920, erupted in the wake of World War I, the Russian Revolution, and widespread labor strikes, both in the United States and abroad. The second Red Scare, which lasted from 1947 until 1954, also called McCarthyism, unfolded during the Cold War as tensions with the Soviet Union deepened. Both periods were defined by a pervasive fear that communists and radical leftists' ideologies threatened the nation's security and moral fabric, prompting waves of ideological persecution, censorship, and regressive social conformity. These campaigns were ostensibly about defending democracy. However, in reality, they reinforced prejudice, suppressed dissenting voices, and marginalized vulnerable groups under the guise of protecting unity. Central to both Red Scares was the idea that ideological purity, a rigid boundary between what was American and what was deemed subversive, opposition to communism, socialism, and anarchism became a test of moral patriotism. Enforcing this purity led to loyalty oaths, blacklists, public trials, and investigations by bodies such as the House Un American Activities Committee, HUAC, and later Senator Joseph McCarthy's Senate Subcommittee. These institutions sought to root out perceived communist infiltration from every sphere of public life, from Hollywood to government agencies. Historian Ellen Schrecker notes that the Red Scare's culture of fear transformed legitimate political dissent into an act of disloyalty, eroding democratic protections for civil liberties. These, this pervasive sense of paranoia also produced an atmosphere of conformity. Challenging mainstream narratives or criticizing the government could result in being branded un American. We're hearing that term used a lot these days. This logic melded patriotism with social homogeneity, encouraging Americans to align with cultural norms around religion, consumerism, and traditional family structures as evidence of their loyalty. Again, this is sounding very familiar right now. Historian Michael Kazin observed that dissent was reframed as deviance, and political orthodoxy merged with everyday acts of assimilation, from voting habits to social manners. Conformity thus became a psychological shield against suspicion and exclusion from society. The enforcement of this ideological purity disproportionately harmed marginalized communities. During the First Red Scare, immigrants, particularly those from Southern and Eastern Europe, were primary targets. The 1919 Palmer raids, led by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, resulted in thousands of arrests and deportations of alleged radicals, often without any due process. Two Italian immigrants, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, became infamous victims of this climate. They were executed after a controversial trial fueled by anti immigrant prejudices and fear of anarchism. African Americans also faced intersecting forms of repression during these times. Historian Charisse Burton-Stelly describes this as the Black Scare, in which Black activists, union organizers, and civil rights activists were accused of communist sympathies, leading to blacklisting, arrests, and deportations. This campaign dismantled progressive unions and curtailed early civil rights momentum. By equating racial justice movements with foreign subversion, white political elites reinforced racial hierarchies and delayed Black liberation. Another marginalized group persecuted during the Second Red Scare were LGBTQ plus Americans in what became known as the Lavender Scare. Homosexuality was considered both a moral failing and a vulnerability to blackmail or disloyalty, leading to thousands of federal employees being fired under President Dwight Eisenhower's Executive Order 104509. This parallel campaign further entwined moral conformity with national security, deepening stigmas that lasted for decades. Multiple mechanisms enforce these policies. Surveillance, loyalty investigations, professional blacklists, and social ostracism served to silence dissent and flatten identity across social domains. Union members, teachers, and artists were forced to sign loyalty oaths or risk losing employment. The Hollywood blacklist, for instance, destroyed the careers of screenwriters and actors accused of refusing to testify before the HUAC, effectively defining Americanism through control of mass media and popular culture. These efforts were less about genuine security threats than about disciplining thought and behavior to preserve cultural status quo. The success of both Red Scares relied on how leaders framed supposed threats to social cohesion. Political and media elites employed an us versus them narrative. Again, very familiar these days. Contrasting loyalty, law abiding Americans with shadowy outsiders, ideological infiltrators, and sinister foreigners. Psychological research shows that this type of framing strengthens group identity and compliance by heightening fear of external danger. During crises, leaders gain authority as protectors, and citizens rally around collective defense rather than critical inquiry. By labeling dissenters or minorities as existential threats to the nation, figures like McCarthy used fear strategically to consolidate power and suppress opposition. This rhetoric also established a shared sense of moral purpose. Americans were urged to stand together in defense of freedom, even as the state curtailed these very freedoms. Framing the world through shared threat fostered a sense of emotional solidarity, transforming anxiety into conformity and patriotism into a form of social policing. The interplay of fear, moral certainty, and leadership's manipulation demonstrates how political cohesion can come at the expense of pluralism and civil rights. The Red Scare left enduring marks on American politics and culture. They shaped attitudes toward civil liberties, immigration, dissent, and education that persist in public discourse today. Each wave of hysteria serves as a cautionary tale. Fear can be weaponized by leaders and institutions to suspend democratic norms and turn diversity into a liability. The victims, immigrants, activists, LGBTQ plus Americans, students, educators, and racial minorities bore the immediate costs, but the broader damage was a chilling effect on free speech, a forcible flattening of social identities, and a degradation of civic trust. The Red Scares remind the public that patriotism can easily slip into exclusion, zealotry, and nationalistic fervor when fear, power, and ideology are bent to a singular purpose.